The knock on my door came the day after my divorce finalized, and when I opened it, there she was, Alora, the wife of the man I had thought I loved, calm, composed, almost clinical. And she didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't accuse. She simply said, "He lied to both of us, but we can do something different." Before I could even ask what she meant, she pulled out a marriage license, already signed. All that was needed was my name. "If you say yes, I promise you'll never regret it," she said. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about love. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about uncovering the truth hidden in plain sight, exposing a web of deception I hadn't even begun to imagine. And I had a choice: walk away or step into a plan that would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, betrayal, and power.
Have you ever replayed a moment in your head over and over, turning it like a coin in your fingers, wondering if someone didn't leave because you weren't enough, but because someone else simply had more to offer, more options, more freedom, more choices that make loyalty negotiable and commitment temporary? That was the question that circled in my mind the morning my marriage ended. Was I not enough, or was I just not rich enough to replace? Because the man she chose didn't just have money, he had options I could never hope to match, options that made my efforts, my sacrifices, my love feel small, like I'd been operating in a life she had already outgrown without me noticing. When she finally walked out, she didn't slam a door, she didn't shout, she didn't even glance back. She just picked up her bag like she was late for a meeting and left me standing in a room that still smelled like the life we were supposed to build together. And the silence she left behind did more damage than any argument ever could, forcing me to fill in the blanks myself, to imagine her laughter in places I wasn't, her conversations with a man I didn't know, her smiles for jokes I would never hear, and each imagined moment cut a little deeper than the last, creating a quiet humiliation that was private, specific, and impossible to ignore. Adulthood doesn't prepare you for this. It teaches you to tolerate quiet dissatisfaction, to call it stress, to blame work, to assume love matures into distance, to accept compromises you would never have consented to in your 20s. But when that illusion collapses, when someone leaves without ceremony or explanation, it leaves you alone with questions no one warns you about, questions about loyalty, about worth, about whether the man who stays always loses to the man who can walk away. I told myself the story ended with an affair and a divorce. It made it survivable, something I could explain to friends, something I could eventually justify to myself. But even as I repeated that narrative, I felt the hollow ache beneath it, the part of me that knew there was more, that this was never just about infidelity, because the affair, as painful as it was just the front door, a prelude, a way to distract from the real damage I couldn't yet see, the damage that would only reveal itself after the quiet, after the divorce papers were signed, after the house was emptied. Because what followed, what came next, was a twist I never saw coming, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about betrayal, about trust, about who wields power in a marriage. And it began the moment I realized this wasn't just about who she chose to leave me for, but why I had been chosen next. And that realization was the first step into a story that would unravel the illusions of love and loyalty I had spent my life believing were unshakable. A story where the real cost of betrayal wouldn't just be emotional, it would be strategic. It would challenge my very sense of agency, and it would leave me questioning not just her choices, but my own capacity to survive the quiet storms that adulthood hides behind civility. Because the hardest truths aren't shouted in arguments, they are whispered in silences. And that silence, that empty apartment, that sudden absence was only the beginning of a lesson I would never forget. A lesson that would test every instinct, every assumption, and every measure of who I thought I was. Because the affair was just the front door, and what lay beyond it was the real story. One I could never have anticipated, one that would redefine the way I saw betrayal, power, and ultimately, myself.
The morning after she left, the apartment felt like a mausoleum, every corner holding memories I wasn't ready to face, and I wandered from room to room like a ghost in my own life, realizing how something so ordinary as a shared Google Calendar could reveal the chaos I had ignored, how weekends labeled client outreach mapped a betrayal I had convinced myself didn't exist, how the subtle signs I had rationalized, late nights, unexplained trips, distant glances, were ignored because adulthood teaches you to justify, to make sense of disappointment instead of confronting it, to assume love grows quiet rather than recognizing silence can be weaponized. I sat on the edge of the couch and felt the full weight of it, that she had been gone long before she walked out, that her absence was gradual, rehearsed, and invisible until it landed fully, and the realization hit harder than any argument ever could, because this wasn't just emotional pain, it was deliberate, precise, almost clinical, like a strategist moving pieces on a board while I was still playing by the rules of honesty and trust. And in that dense, quiet air, where the faint scent of her perfume lingered like a memory, I felt shame and clarity at the same time, grief and comprehension blended into a single sharp awareness, because the affair, painful as it was only a surface, a signpost, not the full story, and what came next would arrive not with anger or confrontation, but calm, deliberate intent. And when I heard the knock at my door, the knock that shattered the quiet and made my heart race, I opened it to see someone I never expected standing there, calm, controlled, unreadable, and at that instant, I understood that the betrayal I had prepared myself for was only the prelude, only the surface damage, because what followed would challenge everything I thought I knew about trust, about strategy, and about power in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And it was in that moment, as the door swung open and the morning light fell across her face, that I realized the real story, the one I hadn't seen coming, was about to begin. A story that would demand I think faster, act smarter, and face consequences far beyond heartbreak, because this wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the opening move in a game I hadn't even known I was playing.
The knock at my door was deliberate and calm, the kind that didn't announce anger or urgency, just certainty. And when I opened it, there she stood, Alora, the wife of the man my wife had left me for, poised, controlled, her eyes steady but her hands betraying the slightest tremor, a subtle human imperfection that made her all the more real. And in that instant, I felt a mix of unease and curiosity because she didn't glare, demand, or accuse. She simply stated a fact I wasn't prepared for. He lied to both of us, and we could do something about it, something that would change everything I thought I knew. And when she pulled out a marriage license, already signed, and placed it in my hands, the world seemed to tilt, because what she was proposing wasn't love, wasn't revenge. It was a strategy, a calculated move that used rules I hadn't realized existed. And I could feel my pulse quicken as the implications sank in, the weight of being chosen for a reason I didn't yet understand, the vulnerability of my life suddenly a piece on a board I hadn't even seen. Yet there was a strange clarity in her presence, a focus so precise it made my own indecision feel sluggish, and I wondered how someone could remain so calm while holding the power to upend everything I had spent years trying to stabilize. The audacity of her plan, the cool certainty that this wasn't about emotion, but leverage. And in that moment, I realized the betrayal I had survived was only the prelude to something far more intricate, because she wasn't asking me to trust her. She was asking me to become part of a mechanism, a trap, a move that would turn my emptiness and heartbreak into the very tool that could undo the man who had shattered our lives. And I felt a shiver of fear, a surge of anticipation, and a reluctant recognition that saying no wasn't just impossible, it might mean missing the only chance to reclaim everything. And as I nodded, slowly, almost instinctively, I felt the story of my old life end in that silent, controlled gaze, because the next step, the one she had outlined but not yet revealed, was going to be unlike anything I could have imagined, demanding every ounce of attention, courage, and cunning I had left. And agreeing to her plan wasn't just a decision, it was an entry into a game where nothing was as it seemed, and the first move had already been made, right there at my doorstep.
When Alora explained the proposal, my mind first rejected it as madness. Marry someone I barely knew, not for love, not for revenge, but as a strategic move, a tool against the man who had shattered our lives. And yet her calmness made the insanity feel almost logical. The way she described the marriage license, already signed, waiting for my name. The audacity of entering a union that was not personal, but tactical. And I felt my instinct scream caution, while curiosity and a quiet spark of defiance pushed me forward. Because saying no felt like stepping out of a game I hadn't even realized I was in, one I was already playing by default. And in that moment, I realized the fear wasn't just about being used again. It was about missing an opportunity to turn my emptiness into leverage, to transform humiliation and heartbreak into a form of control. And as I looked at her, watching her hands remain steady while her eyes hinted at the plan's full weight, I understood this wasn't about romance, connection, or trust. It was about purpose and positioning, a chance to step into a role that demanded attention, courage, and precise judgment. And I felt the strange pull of it, the allure of being chosen for a mission where every move mattered, every hesitation could be costly. And saying yes wasn't surrender, it was transformation, entering a world where my grief and pain became tools, my heartbreak a weapon. And as I slowly nodded, placing my hand on the pen and signing my name, I felt the old life slip away. The marriage I had once dreamed of replaced by a calculated alliance, a silent agreement to play a role I hadn't anticipated. And in that quiet, charged moment, I realized that what followed, the empty wedding, the storage of secrets, the trap she had designed, was already set in motion, waiting for us to act. And agreeing to this marriage wasn't an ending, it was the first move in a game I had no choice but to win. A game where strategy, patience, and courage would determine whether I could reclaim everything that had been taken from me. The chapel was unnervingly quiet. A Thursday morning with no guests, no vows, no fanfare, just Alora and me, two participants in a ritual that felt more like strategy than ceremony. And as I followed her to the table to sign our names, the surreal tension of standing in a space meant for celebration while nothing in me celebrated hit me fully. Her navy coat replaced the dress I had expected, her composure neutral, hands barely touching the pen, and every instinct screamed that this was wrong, absurd, impossible. Yet beneath the oddity was a deeper clarity, a sense that this union, stripped of warmth and ritual, was a tool, a calculated move that required silence as much as precision. And as we completed the signatures, I felt the weight of it, the old life, the assumptions, the illusions of love and trust, ending in that dimly lit room, replaced by a deliberate alliance, a plan designed to reclaim power from those who had hidden behind deceit. And I realized the absence of ceremony, witnesses, or emotion was intentional, because the strength of this move depended on secrecy, on timing, and on the fact that no one would understand until the full story revealed itself. And as I left the chapel with the certificate in hand, the air heavy with unsaid words, I felt disbelief, apprehension, and a strange exhilaration, knowing that the act was legal but the meaning behind it tactical, and that this was only the beginning, that the documents, the revelations, and the traps waiting in quiet places were already set. And as I glanced at Alora, her face calm and unreadable, a promise in her eyes, I understood that the real story, the one exposing layers of deception far beyond anything I had imagined, had begun. And the empty wedding was not a mistake or oddity. It was the first move in a game where patience, timing, and insight would determine the outcome. And stepping into it meant there was no turning back.
Because what awaited us next, the storage unit of secrets, the unfolding proofs of betrayal, had already begun to unfold. And entering that mission demanded every ounce of focus, courage, and cunning I could summon. And in that silent, charged moment, I realized that the quiet ceremony, stripped of everything familiar, had prepared us for the calculated path ahead. A path that would test every assumption, every instinct, and every decision I had left, because the first step had been taken and the stakes had never been higher.
The storage unit smelled of dust and rust, a quiet, almost sterile space that felt removed from time, and when Alora slid the door open, I stepped inside and immediately sensed the weight of secrets pressing down, rows of unmarked boxes stacked like silent witnesses, each holding fragments of lives I thought I knew, pieces of betrayal I had never imagined. And as she pulled them down one by one, reality struck. Photographs, passports, bank statements, documents with unfamiliar names, evidence of lies spanning years and continents. And with each file revealed, the scope became clear. My ex-wife and the man she left me for weren't just cheaters, they were predators, extracting everything from those too vulnerable to resist. And I realized I had been carefully chosen, my heartbreak, invisibility, and emptiness transformed into bait, the perfect tool to draw out the center of their scheme. And I felt a shiver of fear mixed with grim fascination as she laid everything on the metal table, 3 recently married women, all suddenly alone, their stories intersecting like threads in a web I could now see from above, lines tightening around a center I had never understood. And then she looked at me and said, "You're the end game." And in that instant, grief and humiliation became tools, because being the end game gave me a role, a purpose in a plan far bigger than I had imagined. And when she opened a drawer and powered on a burner phone, I saw that our lives had already been weaponized, the messages, notes, and recordings holding the truth we needed. And yet, in her calm presence, I felt steadiness, clarity. This wasn't revenge, it was strategy. And as the first pieces of evidence loaded, I realized the trap was already set, the next moves already written, and stepping fully into this reality meant embracing a role I hadn't chosen but could not refuse, because hesitation could cost everything, my reputation, my life, our chance for justice. And as I stared at Alora, her face unreadable yet determined, I felt the full weight of what was to come and understood that the storage unit wasn't merely a room of documents. It was the battlefield where the depth of their manipulation would be revealed, where we would test our ability to transform betrayal into leverage, and where the first real test of everything we had endured was already beginning, demanding every ounce of focus, courage, and insight I could summon to survive and prevail. As Alora explained why I had been chosen, a chill ran through me, pieces clicking into place with a clarity both terrifying and empowering, because everything I had felt, emptiness, heartbreak, quiet shame, had been observed, measured, and repurposed. And I realized my vulnerability wasn't weakness, but leverage, the perfect camouflage to lure the predator into a trap he didn't know existed. And as she spoke, I felt the weight of that truth settle in. My grief had become a tool, my pain an instrument, and I was no longer passive, but a key part of a plan demanding patience, intelligence, and nerve. And then she pulled a burner phone from her bag, already lit, and handed it to me, the first tangible proof of the deception I had survived but never understood. Messages, recordings, and notes revealing a level of calculation so precise it made my head spin. And among them, a voice memo labeled Phase 4 stood out, instructions and manipulations delivered with surgical detachment. And in that moment, I understood the depth of my ex-wife's operation. She had weaponized our marriage, our history, and my identity, all to serve a plan I was only now glimpsing. And yet, in the same instant, I felt quiet pride.
recognizing that I had become the bait for a purpose far larger than myself, a lure designed to expose the man who thought he was untouchable. And the gravity of that role, the responsibility of being the instrument that could turn deception into exposure, made me pulse with fear and anticipation. Because every action, reaction, and hesitation now mattered. And Alora's eyes met mine with calm certainty, and I finally understood that this wasn't about vengeance or emotion. It was precision, timing, and strategy. And in that understanding, I felt the shift from powerless observer to active participant, from wounded man to key player. And as I reviewed the messages, recordings, and instructions, I realized the next step, the move that would make all of this actionable, was already set, that the bait had been cast, the trap laid, and the success of the plan now depended on how well I played my role, because any misstep could undo everything. And embracing this reality, taking on the part I had been chosen to play, I felt the first surge of agency, knowing that the very thing that had left me broken would now become the force that could expose the truth and finally transform betrayal into justice.
I didn't press play right away, because sometimes your body senses a truth your mind isn't ready to face. And holding that phone, knowing my ex-wife's voice was inside, felt heavier than any document or photograph we had uncovered. And when the recording began, it wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was calm, precise, detached, a tone that discussed logistics instead of lives. And that realization broke me in a way anger never could, because there was no remorse, no guilt, no trace of the woman I once thought I knew, only instructions, schedules, and contingencies delivered with surgical control. And as I listened, it became clear this betrayal wasn't fueled by passion or impulse. It was deliberate, planned months in advance, executed with confidence. And hearing my name used not with affection, but as a variable, a component in a larger operation, made something inside me go quiet. Because the humiliation wasn't emotional, it was structural. My marriage hadn't collapsed, it had been consumed, absorbed into a system designed to extract value and discard what was no longer useful. And my grip on the phone loosened as the recording continued, not out of shock, but because it was so methodical, so ordinary to them, that it stripped away any illusion of love. And in the silence that followed, the weight of the truth settled fully, louder than any words, revealing that the real story began here, not when she left, not when Alora arrived, but at the moment the last illusion died. And I didn't cry, rage, or demand answers, because there was nothing left to question. The voice memo had reframed every memory, every argument, every quiet distance as part of a plan I was never meant to witness. And Alora watched me carefully, not with sympathy, but with understanding, knowing that this was the instant my perspective shifted, because hearing the truth spoken without emotion doesn't provoke a reaction, it demands calculation. And in that clarity, I felt a new focus take hold, a readiness for what came next, not out of desire for revenge, but because understanding replaces confusion and precision replaces fear. And as I handed the phone back to Alora, I knew the plan was no longer abstract, it was actionable. And the next phase, the one that would transform betrayal into leverage, was already in motion, and we were prepared to move.
Alora's calm eyes held a story I wasn't yet ready to hear, and as she explained why she had married my ex-wife's partner, the pieces fell into place with a clarity that unsettled and reassured me. Because it wasn't about love, passion, or romance. It was about leverage, precision, and positioning every player in a plan designed to trap predators in their own web. And I realized the marriage, the signatures, the quiet ceremony in that empty chapel had been a calculated move, a mechanism to grant legal standing, legitimacy, and access to secrets that I alone could use. And she spoke carefully, letting each word land. The alliance wasn't personal, it was tactical,
a way to gather evidence, sequence patterns, and gain authority over people who had hidden in plain sight. And as she laid out the logic, the depth of deception became horrifyingly clear. Shell companies, offshore accounts, multiple identities, repeated manipulations, a network of lies that had quietly grown while the world saw ordinary lives. And I understood then that the marriage itself, my role as a legal participant, and Alora's positioning were all part of a trap that would expose them at the perfect moment, a trap that required patience, focus, and secrecy until the final move. And as she continued, her voice calm but sharp, I felt awe and fear, because realizing the plan's scope made my past grief feel almost trivial, yet it was precisely that grief, that emptiness, that had allowed me to play the perfect part, the one they underestimated, the one who could follow her lead without raising suspicion. And in that realization, I felt a shift. I was no longer just a witness, I was a participant in the unraveling, a critical piece in a plan that demanded every ounce of focus, intelligence, and courage I could summon. And Alora's steady demeanor made it clear that this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, exposing patterns and methods that allowed manipulation. And as I absorbed the full scope, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, because knowing now meant acting, and action had to be measured, deliberate, and precise, because a single misstep could collapse everything. And as she folded the final set of documents and looked at me, the subtle glint in her eyes promised the next phase, the one where every piece of deception would be revealed. And I understood that this marriage, this alignment, was not a story of love, but the opening move in a game of strategy and justice, one demanding we stay several steps ahead. And as I processed it, I knew the next stage, uncovering the full machinery of fraud, shell companies, and hidden assets, was already waiting, and we had to be ready to strike.
Stepping into the full scale of their operation, I finally realized the danger wasn't personal betrayal, it was systemic, meticulous, and designed to run unnoticed for years. A network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake nonprofits all tied to my name without my knowledge. And as Alora guided me through spreadsheets, scanned documents, and legal filings, the picture became chillingly clear. This wasn't just fraud, it was an empire built on exploitation, deception, and absolute control. And the scope made every moment of our previous shock seem almost trivial, because the rules they played by weren't moral, they were calculated, and anyone underestimating them could be consumed before realizing it. And I understood that my ex-wife hadn't just manipulated a marriage, she had leveraged identities, finances, and trust to move millions quietly, leaving trails designed to confuse, mislead, and implicate anyone who got too close. And the more Alora showed me, the higher the stakes became. This wasn't about revenge, it was about survival and precision, because one misstep, one slip in timing could collapse everything. And the cold clarity settled in. Understanding this machinery meant I could anticipate it, navigate it, and turn their own tools against them. But it also demanded responsibility. Act deliberately, document everything, anticipate every countermove, and stay several steps ahead. And as we traced transactions through shell companies registered under false names, through nonprofits that existed only on paper, and through financial conduits hiding millions, I realized the law could easily protect criminals if evidence wasn't airtight. And the pressure forced me to focus like never before, because every piece of data, every timestamp, every alias mattered. And in that focus, I felt the shift. From shock to control, from victim to participant, from powerless to someone who could influence outcomes with precision. And as Alora explained the sequences, contingency plans, and expected behaviors of our targets, I understood that patience was the weapon now, watching patterns, waiting for the right moment, striking only when all elements aligned perfectly. And in that realization, I saw that understanding the fraud machine wasn't just about money or exposure, it was about leverage, safety, and strategy.
and as the last file closed, Alora's eyes met mine with that familiar, calm certainty, promising that whatever came next, we had the knowledge, clarity, and control to execute, because they had built the machine, but now we knew it inside out. It began quietly, in the way calculated people move when they think no one is watching, with a phone call from a lawyer whose name I didn't know, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, explaining there were routine inconsistencies in accounts I hadn't touched, using phrases like administrative review and standard procedure, as if language could disguise the fact that my name was suddenly attached to things I hadn't authorized. And I remember listening, realizing this wasn't concern, it was reconnaissance, testing how aware I was, how much I knew, whether I would panic, because panic is useful to people like them. And I didn't give it. I played confused but cooperative, asked harmless questions, thanked him for flagging the issue, and hung up with steady hands even though my chest tightened, because this was the moment Alora had warned me about, the moment cleanup begins. And 2 days later, my ex-wife reached out, not with anger or guilt, but with casual nostalgia, asking how I'd been, referencing a memory only we shared, suggesting coffee as if nothing had happened. And that's when I realized how deliberate it all was, the lawyer applying pressure one way, her trying to soften me the other, fear and familiarity working together. And what made it dangerous wasn't obvious, it was how reasonable it sounded, how easy it would have been to believe she wanted closure, because adulthood teaches you to crave peace more than truth. But then I noticed the detail that exposed the game, how her message avoided specifics, never mentioned the divorce, only us, framing reconnection as mutual healing instead of accountability. And that told me everything. Because people who want resolution ask questions, people who want control offer comfort. And I didn't respond. Not to her, not to the lawyer. Instead, I opened a new document and titled it Final Move, not for bravery, but because naming something gives you distance from fear. And from that moment, waiting became an action, every hour deliberate, every silence a measure of control. Because reacting too soon would give them information they didn't deserve. And Alora was right, they couldn't help themselves. Their system depended on motion, constant adjustment. And sure enough, buried in a routine review of transaction logs, my name appeared again, not as an error this time, but as a tool, tied to asset transfers that hadn't existed a week earlier, money moving quickly and quietly, like they were packing before an alarm. And standing there watching, I understood this wasn't about covering tracks, it was about escape. And cleanup isn't a sign of safety, it's the signal that someone knows the story is about to turn. The moment the pattern revealed itself, I felt the shift, not emotionally but decisively, because this time we weren't guessing or interpreting behavior, we were watching proof assemble itself in real time. My name appearing again inside a transaction that had no innocent explanation, tied to a property purchase I had never approved, never seen, never benefited from. And as Alara traced the trail slowly and deliberately, the scale became undeniable. Millions moving across borders with the confidence of people who believed no one was paying close attention. And what struck me wasn't just the audacity, it was the assumption behind it. The belief that I would stay passive, confused, grateful for distraction, because the paperwork was clean, in the way only experienced operators manage. Signatures aligned, timestamps spaced just far enough apart, shell entities doing exactly what they were designed to do, which was to make accountability feel distant and abstract. And standing there, looking at a property I'd never visited in a country I'd never been to, purchased in my name, something finally settled, because doubt disappeared. This wasn't a gray area or a misunderstanding. It was wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, clearly defined. And that clarity mattered, not for revenge, but for leverage, because leverage only exists when uncertainty ends. And Alara didn't celebrate it. She didn't smile or react at all. She simply nodded once, like someone confirming a variable she'd been waiting on, and said quietly that this was enough. Not emotionally, but legally.
And that distinction mattered because emotion clouds judgment, and judgment was the only thing protecting us now. And in that moment, the balance shifted again, not between us, but inside me. Because until then, I'd been following her lead, trusting her experience, relying on her preparation. But now, hesitation was gone, and I didn't ask what came next. I told her who I was calling. Not local authorities, not the police, but the investigator she'd mentioned weeks earlier, the one who'd been blocked before, stalled and pressured to step away, because now the evidence wasn't circumstantial, it was undeniable. And when I made the call, my voice didn't shake, not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear had finally been replaced by alignment. Everything pointing in one direction. And when I hung up, Alara looked at me without saying anything, because she didn't need to. The evidence had spoken. And for the first time since the knock on my door, I knew we weren't being hunted anymore. We were the ones deciding when the door would finally open.
The morning we met the federal investigator, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of every transaction, every forged signature, every silent manipulation we had uncovered. And yet the tension wasn't chaotic, it was precise, because we had prepared for this moment for weeks, documenting each transfer, alias, and shell company. And when the investigator walked in, professional and measured, reviewing our folders with practiced calm, I realized the work we had done, Alora and I together, wasn't just about exposing them. It was about creating a case too complete to ignore, a chain of evidence that demanded action. And as she explained what the authorities had already noticed, the loopholes exploited, and how they had been waiting for someone to connect all the dots, the gravity landed, not as fear, but as responsibility. Because now the control wasn't ours, it was procedural, deliberate, and exact, and every step we had taken had to be above reproach. And as I handed over each file, spreadsheet, and digital record, I felt a quiet shift inside me. The reactive, passive version of myself was gone, replaced by someone who could anticipate, navigate, and execute with precision. And yet there was no celebration, only the slow, mechanical unfolding of justice behind the scenes. And when the investigator looked up and said, "We've been waiting for someone like you," it wasn't praise, it was recognition, confirmation that we had arrived at the moment that mattered. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence hung heavy, full of the weight of consequences yet to arrive, because now it was out of our hands. And for the first time since the knock on my door, I understood the scale of what we had done. We hadn't just collected evidence, we had become the pivot, the axis on which accountability would turn. And every deliberate step Alora and I had taken led to this certainty. And as I looked at her, calm and unwavering across the table, I knew we were no longer observers or victims. We were participants in a process that would unfold methodically, inevitably, and silently. And the next chapter, the arrests and the final reckoning, was already waiting beyond the horizon.
A week after handing over every piece of evidence, my inbox lit up with a message from my ex-wife, brief, sharp, and unnervingly casual. "You shouldn't have married her." And for a moment I froze, feeling the subtle weight of years of manipulation, the way she had always tried to unsettle me, to provoke me. But this time it landed differently, because I wasn't the man who had watched her walk out quietly, doubting my worth while she moved on. I had learned patience, strategy, and discipline, and now the power balance had shifted. I held leverage she could never touch. And I typed my reply deliberately, each word carrying clarity instead of anger. Exactly why I did. And hitting send, I felt the release of control reclaimed, the satisfaction of truth delivered quietly, because justice doesn't need spectacle. It moves methodically. And that message was the punctuation before the next phase unfolded, the silent countdown to consequences they had tried to evade. And while she may have intended provocation, it only reinforced the certainty I carried, the calm knowledge that our preparation, patience, and precision had shifted everything. And as I closed my laptop, the room felt lighter, the tension contained, because the warning had arrived and been answered without escalation.
The stage set, the players in motion, and the arrests we had anticipated were no longer distant, they were inevitable, moving silently through the system. And I finally understood that true power waits, calculates, and strikes only when all elements align. And in that quiet, I felt both the weight and relief of knowing we were ready, that the final act was approaching, and all that remained was to watch the sequence unfold with deliberate certainty.
The arrests happened quietly, without sirens or spectacle, just the measured knock on a door during brunch. And I watched from a distance as the system we had set in motion unfolded. Him taken first, expression frozen between disbelief and frustration, the papers in hand sealing years of deceit in a way no confrontation ever could. And there was no celebration on our part, no cheers, only the quiet relief of knowing justice had arrived efficiently, deliberately, and irreversibly. Because real closure doesn't announce itself. It moves methodically, like a machine, precise and unstoppable. And I felt it in the release of months of tension, the way my chest finally stopped carrying anticipation, because the long watch, careful documentation, and patient waiting had led to this moment. And yet it wasn't entirely over, because Alora, calm and observant, remained in the background, tracking every movement, a reminder that even as they were removed from the equation, unseen layers and details might continue to surface. And standing there on the steps, watching the ordinary world continue around an extraordinary disruption, I realized justice is rarely loud or satisfying in the way stories promise. It is subtle, measured, and leaves its mark not through spectacle, but through the quiet recalibration of those left behind. And as I finally breathed fully, letting the weight lift slightly, I understood that closure in adulthood doesn't roar, it whispers, it reshapes perspective, it settles like dust on furniture after a storm. And we walked away with the knowledge that their chapter had ended, but the consequences of their actions would linger, shaping choices, teaching caution, and proving that silence after justice can speak louder than any dramatic climax. 6 weeks after the court proceedings, Alora and I sat across from each other at the clerk's office, signing the annulment papers with calm precision, the air neutral, almost clinical, because this wasn't about romance or reconciliation. It was about closing the mission we had undertaken together. And yet, even in that quiet, there was a subtle tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that what we had shared, while never romantic, had been transformative in its clarity and intensity, teaching me about patience, observation, and the kind of insight only adversity can provide. And as the documents were stamped and filed, I felt both relief and respect. Relief that the formal tie was gone, and respect for the woman who had guided us through the maze of deceit without letting anger or revenge cloud her judgment. And as we rose, there was a pause, heavy with meaning, yet silent. A moment of recognition that while the marriage had been fake on paper, it had been real in the lessons it left behind, shaping perspective, resilience, and understanding. And as we stepped into the sunlight outside, it felt like walking forward from a storm, leaving behind not only the people who had deceived us, but also the versions of ourselves that had been vulnerable, reactive, and naive. And while we didn't speak of what could have been, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that our partnership, strategic and deliberate, had revealed capacities we hadn't known existed: patience, focus, calculated action. And as we parted, no hugs, no promises, just a nod and shared understanding, I realized that closure in adulthood is often quiet, measured, and ambiguous. And sometimes the strongest connections are forged not in romance, but in the calm of purpose and the intensity of strategy. And in that subtle recognition, I felt completeness, knowing the chapter had ended, but the lessons, confidence, and clarity it left behind would guide every decision and boundary from that moment forward. Months after everything had settled, the annulment completed, the arrests finalized, the echoes of deception fading into procedural history, I sat alone in the apartment that once carried betrayal and silence, reflecting on the journey from loss to clarity, realizing that survival isn't about revenge, and justice isn't always loud. It is often subtle, measured and deliberate. And adulthood teaches that closure doesn't arrive with drama, but with a careful understanding of boundaries, trust, and personal responsibility. And as I thought about the lessons learned, I asked myself the question I had avoided for so long. How do you rebuild confidence in people, in decisions, in relationships when the past proves loyalty can be manipulated and trust both fragile and powerful? And the answer wasn't simple, because I didn't need a storybook ending. I needed awareness, not naive optimism, but insight into my own choices, reactions, and standards. And in that reflection, I acknowledged Alora's role, not as a partner, not as a romantic figure, but as a guide, strategist, and mirror revealing both my vulnerabilities and potential. And with that recognition came quiet peace, a readiness to navigate trust with vigilance without cynicism, understanding that true strength lies not in vengeance or spectacle, but in foresight, measured response, and resilience. And as I rose from the chair, I realized the story hadn't ended, it had transformed. The lessons, clarity, and strategies now belonged to me, and the final question lingered in my mind. If loyalty can be exploited and trust tested, how will I now choose to extend it, and to whom? And in answering that, I understood that the ultimate measure of growth isn't closure or justice. It's the courage to face the world again with discernment, resilience, and the quiet certainty that the next chapter is mine to define.